Welcome to week 5 and topic 4.1, the person situation debate. My name is Dr. Kathy Ryan and I'll be taking you through week 5's content, where by the end of this week you should be able to explain the origins of the person situation debate, describe the arguments put forward to support situationism, describe the defense made by personality psychologists, and describe the recent return to the debate. So the fundamental issue is, do traits make a difference? And this is in your Funder textbook in chapter 4, and we talk about person situation debate. One of the key reasons we study personality is if we can study someone's personality, we may be able to predict their behaviour. It's one of those critical outcomes. We make judgments about someone's behaviour using a layperson's approach, sometimes naive approach. We intuitively do these things. We make judgments. But also, when we formally measure someone's traits, like we did in our week 2's tutorials, once we understand someone's personality, we can try and predict their behaviour. Therefore, if people were not very predictable, there'd be no point in doing this course. So there's an assumption that comes along with studying personality, that there should be some sort of consistency in our behaviour across time and across situations. So the key aspect to personality is, can we predict behaviour? But you know that we do not act the same way in different situations. Some people like to use, say, the chat function in a live lecture, and others might prefer to chat during and after tutorials, like real life versus virtual. You might act differently in different situations. Sometimes, depending on your tutor or your lecturer, you might engage, and other times you won't. So we expect people to act the same way in different situations, but in reality, we act differently in different situations over time. Your behaviours, plus over time, your behaviours may have changed. This has been named the consistency paradox, or the personality paradox. And it started off a huge debate that started in 1968. So as I said, this debate started off in 1968, mainly due to a publication of a book by Walter Mischel called Personality and Assessment. The crux to this debate was that traits are not the only thing that guides our personality, but that situations also determine how we behave. For instance, you'll behave differently at a party than you would, say, in your tutorial class. So it came down to the question: traits are not the only factors that control behaviour. Situations are also important. And which is more important for determining what people do, the person or the situation? So situationism is the belief that behaviour is largely driven by the situation and that personality is relatively unimportant. So you can imagine at the time how some people may have reacted to this type of statement as it went against their studies, against what they were engaged in, what they were deeply involved in. So you may have heard of Walter Mischel, as he was the inventor of the marshmallow test. I've added this content in the Learning at Griffith to remind you. It's a delay of gratification test. I think it's re-shown on many TikToks lately. And this was ironically a test of individual differences and personality. Mischel's experiment suggested that an individual's behaviour is not simply the result of his or her traits, but fundamentally dependent on situational cues, the needs of the given situation. So Mischel's ideas led him to develop the cognitive affective model of personality. But as I said, he wrote this other book personality and assessment, and check out the funder text to understand more about this. And one of his points from the book was that the predictability of behaviour by personality is relatively small. He found the correlations between behaviour and personality are low, like 0.3. And remember, if you remember about these sorts of things, about the correlation sizes, we want them to be closer to 1. So this is fairly low. Therefore, even if personality traits do exist, they're giving us a relatively low correlations to predict behaviour. So with this information, well, it quite obviously upset many personality researchers and really put them on the back foot, because he'd done quite a bit of work in this. And their response was that Michelle and Nesbitt and others who were trying to do this, these reviews, only chose studies that fit their agenda. And cherry picking, it's one of those replication issues that we'll talk about in week 12 as well. But it's about cherry picking different studies that gave them the answers that they wanted. So they also found that, because Nesbitt did further studies and found that it wasn't really 0.3, it was more 0.4, that the correlation of 0.4 means that it's 70% accurate, which actually isn't that bad. So the second situationist argument, argument number 2, is the power of the situation. So Michelle argued that situations have bigger effects on behaviour than do traits. So the rationale of personality equals a correlation of 0.4 accounts for 16% of variance in behaviour. The 84% is due to the situation. So think of experiments that you have been exposed to in the past, from 1002 PSY, the Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgren's electric shock experiments. These all talk about the power of the situation. So again, the argument was, personality is such a small part of the outcome, what is the point and why should we bother? So personality researchers got to it and responded to this. Their response was, situations and traits are not dependent. They are going to be interactions between the two. The difference between how personality researchers compared to situationalists or social researchers measure things, they measure things differently. Personality researchers will look at correlations between your existing traits and your behaviours or outcomes. Whereas for studies of situations, researchers will manipulate the situation. So experimentalists will put you into different groups or conditions and expose participants to different situations. So experimental psychology is looking at group differences, not like personality studies that look at correlations. So that makes them really tough to compare the different types of studies. So how much effect do situations have? We're going to think that social psychologists typically use experimental designs as compared to personality psychologists. So social psychologists or experimental psychologists will, as I said, allocate participants to conditions and typically use Cohen's d to estimate an effect and focus on that significance testing, so p-values. Personality psychologists typically use correlational designs, so they measure pre-existing traits and typically use variance accounted, so the R-squared, and they focus on the magnitude of the differences between those. So while psychs are looking, social psychs are looking at significance, personality are looking at correlations. So they're really different metrics. So they're like comparing apples and oranges. But what if we could convert these effects? So Funder, our great textbook writer, and Donosa started calculating these conversions. So some situational studies and variables, you can see they're sitting there on the left-hand column. You can see that there's some of those different variables. So for instance, the bystander effect or the isolation of a victim, incentives to change things. And there we're looking at the different variables and then the behavioural outcomes. And you can see the effect sizes are quite large. So 0.76, 0.9, 0.8, 0.91, 0.7, they're quite large in the effect size when we're looking at Cohen's d. But once you convert those to correlation effect sizes, you can see that they have very similar to the effect sizes reported in personality studies. So we're doing the 0.3s and 0.4s. That was pointed out by Walter Mischel as a negative thing. So here we're seeing that the effect sizes in some of these major studies that look at situations, the effect sizes match the correlation effect sizes as well. So this was their argument. So I've added this study here. This is not part of your examinable studies. I just wanted to point out that there was a study done by Richard et al. In 2003 that looked at a range of topics over 100 years and compared these things. They found that the mean correlation, the R, ranges from 0.13 to 0.32, and overall the average is 0.21, as you can see at the bottom of the page. And this was in articles that had a century of social psych research, and yet we still come up with that same R value being averaged out. So the situationist argument number 3 is that all personality studies are flawed. So, they're a waste of time. Doing personality assessments or any of that, it is a waste of time. The response to this one by the personality researchers was, as demonstrated previously, the correlation of 0.4 is quite a useful one, as it gives 70% accuracy of predicting people's behaviour. The effect size of the situation is not any greater than personality. If anything, it is less. And that actually informant data, how others perceive your personality and outcomes, is quite reliable and actually better predictors than your own perception of your personality. So remember, our BLISS data, the informant data, gives you some really good predictors. And also, as we noted in the lexical hypothesis, the words used to describe traits are reflected in our everyday language. And this will be discussed during your tutorials in week 4 or 5 about the differences between the self and the informant. So we'll go into this in more detail, but just to show you that is what they meant, is the informant data was quite reliable. So in The Defense of Personality, written by Carver and Shea, an extreme form of the attacks on traits was called situationalism. This is the idea that situational variables determine behaviour, not personality. This view was held by some social psychologists who traditionally emphasised the impact of the social environment rather than personality as a cause of actions. This view assumed that correlations between traits and behaviours were low because situational variables overwhelmed the effect of personality. This, in fact, turned out to be quite wrong. I really encourage you to read the Funder text and also listen to the Black Goat podcast about situation normal. And there's also a YouTube talk by Angela Duckworth, which is worth checking out as well in regard to this situation versus person debate.